Hello everyone and welcome. For today's tutorial we're going to be doing the Vince doll. So what I started with was prepping my fabrics, because when you bought the design it also came with a PDF instruction file, and in there it has a list going from A all the way to P of the size fabrics that you'll need to cut for your specific hoop size you're using. So I've already got mine pre-cut out for the 8x12 hoop, and I made it easier for me by taking the letter that it coordinates with and just attaching it to the fabric, and I've pretty much put them in order from A to P, so that way when I read the instructions everything's readily available for me. Alright, well, let's get started. I've got my machine ready with my first file already in my embroidery machine, and I've got a piece of tearaway stabilizer hooped, so I will start the first stitch. Okay, our first stitch is complete and it's a placement stitch. So what you're going to want to do is grab one of the two pieces of fabric that you cut for A and B, which is the shirt and the arms. So the part for the shirt, which is part B, you're going to lay down right side up just over this first stitch line. You can see the squares right here. You're going to lay it over this first stitch line. And then you're going to take what you have for fabric B and you're going to lay it right side down right over the top of this fabric, because it's going to do a tack down stitch right across that line. Okay, so our tack down stitch is complete, and for the next step you're going to take this top piece of fabric and you're going to just pull it down this way. Okay, so for your next stitch, it's going to do a tack down stitch, basically just making a square around this whole thing, tacking this side of the fabric down and then securing the top side of this fabric to the stabilizer. Okay, so we have the lines stitched down. So what you're going to want to do now is remove everything from the hoop, and you're just going to cut away the excess fabric around the sides, not too close in, but leave enough, and we're going to set this aside. Okay, so we're ready to move on. You should have uploaded your next file into your embroidery machine, which was labeled Arms Part B. Now this step is the same exact step as the first one, which was labeled Arms Part A, which this is how it came out to be after I cut everything. Set this aside. So the first couple of steps you're going to do the same exact thing. You're going to lay down that top piece of fabric. And that was going to be right side up. Lay down your second piece of fabric, and that one's going to be right side down on top of the other piece of fabric, and then you're going to stop from there. Okay, so you guys should be with me at this part of part B of the arms. So we've got our tack down stitch, tacking down both pieces of fabric to the stabilizer. So you're going to take your first piece of fabric that you did for the last one, which was arms A, and you're going to put it right on top, right side down, on top of arms B. Now you want to make sure that these two lines line up with these two lines right here. So this line of the arms lines up with the shirt. And you want to make sure you're completely in the square, because the next step is to actually do the outline of the arms. Okay, once you get that all set, we're going to do the outline of the arms. Okay, so your machine should have indicated that this was the last stitch in this particular part of the design. So as you can see, we have the outline of the arms. So what you're going to want to do now is remove everything from the hoop, take away the stabilizer, and you're going to cut away the excess fabric on both the arms, and then you're going to turn them right side out. You want to put them off to the side because we're not going to use them at this moment, but what you can do is put the stuffing in and then set them off to the side. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to our next part in the project, and you should have uploaded into your embroidery machine the file labeled legs back. Now from here, we're going to hoop another piece of stabilizer, and there's going to be a placement stitch done for your first piece of fabric. But here's what we did in our last project. So these how the arms came out. I turned them right side out and I gave them a little bit of a stuffing, not too much, just enough to give it some bulk. And then I left a little bit of padding off the inside here. That way when the stitching goes along here to attach it to the body, this bulk is not getting in the way. So we're going to put these off to the side, and we're going to do our placement stitch for our first piece of fabric. Okay, so here we have our placement stitch. So now you want to grab your first piece of fabric that was labeled C, and you should have cut 2 for C. You take your one of the 2 pieces, and right side up you want to place your fabric over the lines, because your next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch securing this piece of fabric to your stabilizer. And then after that there's another stitch that's also a placement stitch, so I'm going to go ahead and do that one as well. So I'm going to do the tack down stitch for this one and then a placement stitch for our next part of the design. Okay, so our tack down stitch is complete, which secured this large piece of fabric to our stabilizer. And then I did the placement stitch, which is the next design. Now you're going to grab one of 2 that you cut for fabric D, and you're going to want to place it right side down. See where these lines are? You're going to want to place this piece of fabric right side down, just over those 2 lines on either side. See here are the top of the lines right there. Grab this piece of fabric and you're going to put it just over the lines on both sides. Move it over a little bit. I just want to make sure there's equal space on both sides. Okay, and so our next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch. Okay, so our tack down stitch is complete. Now what you want to do is take this piece of fabric and you want to pull it down this way. And you want to completely cover this under stitch right there. And just pull it down this way. And your next stitch is going to tack down this piece of fabric right there. Okay, so now we have the top part of our fabric right here secured to our stabilizer, and then I went ahead and did the placement stitch for the next piece of fabric, and that should be the next part down on your design. So you want to gonna take fabric E, and you're gonna place it right, and you're gonna have it right side up, and you're gonna place it right over this whole area right here. So what I did was I aligned it down at the bottom here with my other piece of fabric, and I just made sure that it goes over these lines, because basically it's going to go just up to this point right here. All right, so the next stitch is going to secure this piece of fabric to your stabilizer. Okay, so the tack down stitch is complete. I know it's kind of hard to see because it's black, but what you want to do now before your last stitch in this part of the design is you want to take some sharp scissors or your applique scissors, and you want to cut away just at the top here, right over where you just stitched. So I'm going to go ahead and cut, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is what I meant when I said cut along this little half circle here. You want to cut along there because your last stitch is a finishing stitch, and it's going to be a satin stitch that's going to go right across here and right across there. So you want to make sure you cut as close to the stitch line as possible. Okay, so our satin stitch is finished. So what you're going to want to do is remove everything from the hoop, rehoop another piece of stabilizer, and upload the file labeled legs front. So from here you're going to remove everything, and just like the arms, you're just going to cut off the excess fabric, but you only want to cut around the square because this part is going to be attached to our next part, just like the arms. Okay, so we have our next piece of stabilizer hooped and ready to go, and I have my next file design already up in my embroidery machine ready to go, which was labeled legs front. So it's going to start off very simple and very much like the last design, which this was it. This was our last design. See, I just cut out and I cut around the square, and this is what you want to keep and lay off to the side because we're going to be using this in a little bit. So what you want to do now is put down your placement stitch for your next piece of fabric. Okay, so we have our placement stitch in our hoop for our next piece of fabric. So you're going to grab your next piece of C fabric, and right side up you're going to lay it down completely over the line, your placement line. Okay, so your next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch, which is going to secure this piece of fabric to the stabilizer. And then I'm going to do a placement stitch, which is the next stitch right after this one. Okay, so our fabric is secured to our stabilizer, and I went ahead and did the placement stitch for our next piece of fabric, which is your other piece of fabric labeled D. So what you're going to want to do, like you did for the last piece of the design, you want to take and put it face down just over the lines, just over these top lines right there. So our next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and do this tack down stitch, and I'm going to move forward because this is the same thing as we did for the last one. So after the tack down stitch, you're going to take this piece of fabric and you're going to pull it down over these placement stitches, and then you're going to do your next stitch, which is a tack down stitch. It's going to tack down this piece of fabric face up over these little placement stitches right here. Okay, so now our top piece of fabric is secured to our stabilizer in our hoop, and then I went ahead and did the placement stitch for the top part of the sneaker. So you want to grab your piece of fabric that was labeled F, and right side up you want to place it over the lines and just make sure it's completely covering your placement stitch. Okay, your next stitch is going to be your tack down stitch. Okay, so here we have our tack down stitches, and what you're going to want to do next is you're going to want to, just like the last file, you want to cut away the fabric here, but this time you also want to cut around right here and right at the bottom here. So these two places at the top and the bottom, you want to make sure that you cut away the fabric, because your next couple stitches are going to be finishing satin stitches, and they're going to go right over where you cut. Okay, so here I have my fabric cut away. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the next couple stitches, which are some finishing stitches and decorative stitches, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so we finished our decorative stitches, and then I went ahead and did a placement stitch for the next part of the design. And so you want to grab your piece of fabric labeled G, and you want to place it face up completely over the stitches the placement stitches that were just made. And then we're going to do our tack down stitch. Okay, so our tack down stitch is complete, and now for this portion you want to take a pair of applique scissors, sharp scissors, and you want to cut away just at the top portion. Right up top here, you want to cut away at the top portion all the way across, because it's going to do a satin finishing stitch over the raw edge right there. Okay, so I cut around just the top part, so we're going to do our satin stitch next. Okay, so our last couple of stitches were a bunch of decorative stitches, which made the shoelaces and the holes for the shoelaces. This is really cute. So our last step in this design is to take your fabric that you did for the back piece, and you're going to lay it right side down. See, this is what we did the last time. You want to lay it right over the top, and you want to line up your fabric on the other side. This is what I mean about lining up your fabric. See right here, this line and this line, you want them to connect, as well as having the shoes connect in the proper place. Okay, this looks good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the final stitch. It's actually two stitches. It does one leg and then it does the other. So I'm going to go ahead and do those. Okay, so your machine should have indicated to you that that was the last stitch in this file. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to completely remove everything from the hoop, remove the stabilizer, cut away the excess fabric, and we're going to turn the legs right side out. Okay, so our last step, we made these, which are the legs turned right side out, and I put a little bit of stuffing on both, leaving a little bit of edge here, so that way it's nice and soft. But we're going to go ahead and put these off to the side. And our next design, which you should have uploaded into your embroidery machine, is labeled the collar. So this one's only 2 steps. This file only has 2 steps. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do a placement stitch. Once we do the placement stitch, you're going to take your 2 pieces of fabric, which should have been labeled H. You're going to place them over the placement stitch, and then you're going to tack them down together. So I'm going to go ahead and do the placement stitch, then I'll show you how to do the place the fabric. Okay, so here's our placement stitch. So you're going to want to put your fabric over. Make sure you put your 2 pieces of fabric right side together so they're sandwiched, and you're going to place them right over those placement stitches so that you're completely covering them. And then we're going to do the tack down stitch. Okay, so our tack down stitch is done, so we're going to remove this from the hoop, and you're going to cut along the line here to separate these two, but also you want to try to follow this line across the fabric this way, because you want to cut it here, here, and then around the collar, and then you're going to turn them right side out. So just cut them along the lines here. So if you follow this line straight out, cut this line, cut here, cut this line, cut here, turn them right side out, and then we're going to put them off to the side. Okay guys, so when last I left you, we were working on the collars, and this is what they should look like right side out. I just went ahead and give them a little bit of a press so they lay a little bit flatter. So we're going to put these to the side. We don't need them right now. But what you're going to need is your legs right now, not to attach them, but for our next portion, you will need a sewing machine. So you're going to grab fabrics P, which is the last set of fabrics, and it was labeled trousers. So you're going to grab P, and at the bottom of each of these, you're going to do a little bit of a roll because you want to do a rolled hem. So you're just going to roll them a little bit, and then you're going to do a straight stitch right across the bottom to give it a rolled hem look, and you're going to do it on both of these. Okay, so I did a nice rolled hem, and what I did was I just folded the fabric over twice, and then I just did a straight stitch across the middle there. So what you're going to want to do now is fold it right sides together so the edges match, and then you're going to do a little straight stitch across the side here, and you're going to do that for both. Okay, so you should have 2 of these now, and what you're going to do is you're going to turn them right side out. You're going to do that to both of them. And then once they're right side out, you're going to take one of the legs and you're going to go ahead and just slip that on. So it becomes part of the pants, basically the bottom trouser part. So you're going to bring the legs through and then just make sure that the ends meet right in the middle there. And that's what the legs should look like. So go ahead and do that for the next one, and then we'll move on. Okay, so what we last did is we went ahead and put the little trouser pieces on the legs. So this is what it should look like. And when you go to attach it, make sure that the seams are facing towards each other. So we're going to go ahead and put these aside. And for the next step, you want to grab fabrics J and L. So our first stitch is going to be a placement stitch, and it's going to be a big placement stitch. I went ahead and used my same stabilizer that I used for my collars. As you can see, I was really careful taking it out, so I barely tore it, and then but just went ahead and patched it at the back. Don't want to waste any material. So I'm going to go ahead and do the placement stitch and be right back. Okay, so we have our placement stitch, and what you're going to want to do is grab J and L. J is going to be face up on bottom, and you want to, this line that goes right here, you want to put it just over that line. And then for your L piece, you're going to do face down right on top of your last piece of fabric. You're going to make sure it's aligned. And you're going to do it right on top, because your next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch, and it's going to tack these two together. Okay, so the file that we uploaded was the back. It should be labeled back for this step. So what you want to do now is take this top piece of fabric and you want to bring it down. Because for the next step, it's gonna be a 2-part. This one stitch will be 2 parts. It'll do not only a tack down stitch for this piece of material to make sure it lays down, but it's also going to serve as a placement stitch for your next piece of fabric that's going to go on. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we have our placement stitch, which served as a tack down for this piece of fabric and a placement for our next piece of fabric. So you're going to want to take one of the two pieces that were labeled K, and you're going to want to do the same thing as we did up here. You're going to take it face down, and you're going to place it just over the placement line, because your next stitch is going to be a tack down stitch, which is going to tack down this piece of fabric to the stabilizer. Okay, so our fabric is secured to our stabilizer. You want to bring this piece of fabric down, and for our next stitch, it's going to do a tack down stitch, but it's not going to do it down here. It's going to do it right across the top here. And then the following stitch, which should be the last stitch in this file, is going to make two pockets. So I'm going to go ahead and do those next two steps. Okay, so your machine should have indicated to you that that was the last stitch in this file. And so it tacked down right across the top here, and then it made the pockets. So our next step is we're going to remove everything from the hoop, and we're going to remove the stabilizer. Don't cut away any fabric, just remove the stabilizer, and we're going to set this to the side. We're going to rehoop another piece of stabilizer, return it to our machine, and upload our next file. Okay, we should be ready to go for our last design, and the one that should be up in your embroidery machine should be labeled front, and this is the last file in this design. And what you're going to need for this one is at this moment, the fabric labeled O. And you're also going to need some kind of ruler and something to mark with, because what you're going to want to do is after the placement stitch, we need to mark the center down by the neckline, because we're also going to be putting on the collar. So let's first do the placement stitch and we'll go from there. Okay, so we have the outline of the body, and that was the first stitch. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and do the second stitch, which gives you this stitch that goes straight across the neckline. So what you're going to want to do is face up. You're going to want to grab your fabric O and put it down right there. And before you put it over the line, take your measuring tool and you're going to measure the lines between the edge of the neck on both sides. So we're going to measure from here to here, and it's about 4 inches. So you're going to find the middle, which is 2 inches, and you're going to mark the center. Okay, so now you want to put your fabric just over the line. And if you need to move your mark up a little bit so you can see, go ahead and do that. But we're going to put our fabric just over the line, making sure it's within these other lines as well. And then you're going to take your collar pieces and you're going to place them so that they make an upside down V. And you're going to put them, align them with the other piece of fabric, and make sure the tip of the upside down V is right in that middle area right there. So you have your upside down V, you have the collars right at the edge, and they meet right in that middle center part where you marked. And your next stitch is going to tack down these pieces of fabric to your stabilizer. Okay, for this last stitch, if you noticed, it went from the tack down stitch right into an outline of the head. I went ahead and did this tack down stitch first so that way I can make sure this was secured. And it also gave me a placement stitch for our next piece of fabric, which is labeled N. So you want to take that one and you want to put it right over this top fabric, this bottom fabric here, and you're going to align it with the last piece of fabric you just tacked down. So I'm going to do that stitch again, and that one is going to tack down this stitch and secure this piece of fabric to the stabilizer. Okay, so now that we have the fabric tacked down, you're going to grab this piece of fabric you just laid down and you're going to pull it up so it completely covers this first outline, because this next stitch is going to secure this piece of fabric to the stabilizer in the shape of the head. Okay, so now we have our top piece of fabric that's secured to the stabilizer. And so our next step is to do a placement stitch, which I already went ahead and did, which will be down here. And you're going to grab your one of two piece of fabrics M, and you're going to place it right side down just over that placement line. Okay, make sure it's nice and straight, because your next stitch is going to tack down this piece of fabric and secure it to your stabilizer. Okay, this last stitch, when it secured it here, and then it moves on to the next stitch, which is the bottom part. So go ahead and go back one stitch, and we're going to do this line again, but this time you want to bring this fabric down and make sure it's nice and tight, because that same stitch that tacked this fabric down is going to go right over the top. Okay, so now we have that nice tack down line across the middle, securing this piece of fabric down. So our next couple of stitches is mainly decorative stitches and tack down stitches for the bottom part of the Vince doll. So I'm going to go ahead and do the next 3 stitches, which is basically the outline of the bottom, the outline of the pockets, and then it's going to go into a placement stitch for Vince's hair. Okay, so we have the outline of the bottom done, and we did the pockets, and then I went ahead and did the placement stitch for the hair. So if you're there with me, you're going to grab O, your fabric labeled O, and you're going to place it right over the entire head, right side up. And the next stitch is going to tack this down. Okay, so we have the tack down stitch of our hair, and what you're going to do is you want to grab your applique scissors or a sharp piece of scissors, and you're just going to cut away just this center part right here, just along this center area. You're going to leave the outside, just cut the inside, because our next couple of stitches are going to be decorative stitches. I'm going to go ahead and do those, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so we have our face and our hair. He is almost done. So our next stitch is going to be a placement stitch for his arms and legs. Okay, so from this point you can either do it one of two ways. If you're not comfortable placing everything in and having it do a tack down stitch all at once, you can go back and redo the placement stitches and do the arms and the legs one at a time. So what I mean is, like for me, because I'm using my 10 needle, it's easier for me. I did my placement stitches for the arms and the legs. So I'm going to go back now, and I went back and redid, and I went back to the stitch that does the placement stitches for the arms and the legs. So now one at a time, I'm going to start and stop my machine and have it tack down each individual piece of Vince. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so this is what I was saying when I said we can do it one at a time. I backed my machine up one stitch, and that was basically, I'm doing the placement stitch all over again for the arms and the legs. I did them individually. I just went back, and as the stitch came here, I would stop my machine, and then I would go place the other arm, let it stitch over, stop the machine, place this one. So I did everything one at a time, and because the next stitch is the tack down stitch for the arms and legs, and it tacks down everything at once versus one at a time. So it's up to you which way you would like to do it. Okay, so I went ahead and positioned my arms and legs so that they sit inside the outline of the body, because our next step is to take our back piece of fabric that we made, and you're going to place it directly over the top. And then this last stitch is going to secure this top piece of fabric to the bottom piece of fabric. Okay, so when you're placing this piece of fabric over, you want to make sure that you align these lines, these fabric lines, with these bottom fabric lines. So you want to make sure that they line up. And if it's easier because it is bulky, I take some pins, and especially towards the top here where I have a bulk of my fabric, and just on the outside, I go ahead and place a pin. So that way my fabric will stay. Okay, so once we've taken him out of the hoop and we've cut away the excess fabric, leaving a little flap on where the gap is to tuck, now we're going to turn him right side out. We're going to stuff him, and then I'm going to ladder stitch close, and we should be done. So I'm going to go ahead and do it, and then I'll show you how he turned out. Okay everyone, he is done. I went ahead and stuffed the head and the body. I didn't overstuff him, but I stuffed him enough to make him nice and soft. I ladder stitched on the side here closed, and this is what he looks like. I think he is adorable. Got your legs with the little sneakers. These came out so good. So I hope your project turned out even better, and I can't wait to see what you guys have done with your Vince doll. All right, happy stitching everyone.